So Sandy was going to cover the first sections, avoid prolonged fasting, sick day precautions, and the general concepts of the diet. So when she gets reconnected with all of us, we can go back to that. But I'll go ahead and start with this middle section, which is carnitine supplementation. So this was one area of guidelines that was covered. And as we heard from Melanie earlier today, there is some controversy out there with carnitine, but what was definitely agreed on in the guideline process is that in a well individual, L-carnitine supplementation may not be needed. So the controversy that still remains is if carnitine increases production of long-chain acylcarnitines and if it promotes toxic effects, especially in those prone to cardiomyopathy. So the things that we did have good consensus with was monitoring levels of total and free carnitine, which Melanie spoke to earlier. And then she also mentioned that magic number of less than 10 as being an area that if you have a provider who hasn't used carnitine before, these are the recommendations now, is that if you do have a free carnitine that's below 10, normal, as Melanie mentioned, and it differs in different labs, but it could be from 30 to 50 or 20 to 50, that the 10 is definitely low. And she, again, talked about where carnitine is stored, so the number that's being measured in the blood is not the full amount of carnitine that's available to the body. And then if you are low on carnitine, the recommendations are to start with a lower dose between 10 to 25 milligrams per kilo per day. And then there was no consensus that was reached in what to do when somebody is acutely ill. So again, discuss carnitine supplementation with your provider as what is best for you. So next we'll talk a little bit about exercise recommendations, and we had a nice introduction with Melanie again on this subject. And so what was really interesting out of the nominal group in the guideline process is that what we are recommending now is that people don't avoid exercise or activity, but we're actually encouraging it. We know that routine physical activity can promote lean body mass, it can lower heart rate, it might improve muscle function, and it can increase the mitochondria that Melanie spoke about earlier well, which improves substrate oxidation. So also what's very important is assuring that you have adequate energy and protein to maintain lean body mass, and your dietitian at your clinic can assist you with that. And this information about the amount of time that appears to be safe has come from Melanie's, Dr. Gillingham's lab and some other labs around the world, where it appears that 20 minutes is pretty well tolerated in this group, but avoiding over 45 minutes may be very important for some individuals. One additional thing that we talked about in the nominal group was for all of us to be aware that play for younger individuals with VLCAD could be seen as a big stressor for them. So if you are planning a big day at the zoo or the park or a swim party, it's important to think about making sure that they have adequate energy to fuel them for a fun day in those activities. So Melanie talked about MCT use in her studies, and what we have seen through some of the work is that MCT might improve the biochemical laboratory markers and physiological parameters, such as could it be a key indicator for decreasing episodes of rhabdomyolysis, and then decreasing those levels of creatine kinase that we can see elevated in some of these individuals. So additionally, Melanie mentioned this too, being fit is probably one of the best kind of preventive markers that you can have. So routine exercise prescription might be the best way to help prevent those rhabdomyolysis events. So what's a good amount of MCT to take before exercise? And again, these numbers have come from Dr. Gillingham's labs. And you can see that the suggestion is to give MCT at least 20 minutes prior to exercise. Up to 45 minutes would be the longest you'd want to go. If you take it much before that, it's probably not going to be well utilized during your exercise bout. So the recommendation is to do between 0.1 to 0.3 grams per kilo of total body weight, or if you have been connected where you're able to know your lean body mass, recommendations are 0.25 to 0.5. This is a pretty good amount of MCT, so if you're somebody that hasn't been on MCT in a while and is looking to start this, you may need to start lower so that you don't have the GI intolerance that's known with MCT consumption. It's often best tolerated too if you mix it with a glucose solution like a Gatorade or apple juice or a fruit beverage of your choice. And then one of the other things that we discussed in our guideline process is to not add an additional dose of MCT if you're starting an exercise, but maybe take one of those that was going to be given around a time where you weren't so active and moving that to before the exercise. So one of the things that we talk a lot about is how about what should I do with my nutrition after exercise? So here are some recommendations about post-exercise fuel. And what's important here is to replenish muscle glycogen and help repair muscle tissue. There's something out there with athletes known as the glycogen window, which is the time where the enzyme glycogen synthase, which helps us with the storage of the glycogen, is most active, and that's usually about that 30-minute to 45-minute period. Excuse me for the interruption. I think Sandy's going to try to sign back on. And then what's a good goal is for adults to have 100 to 200 calories before that exercise bout. And so for younger kids, you could do about 50% of this. And so some examples would be like chocolate milk, pretzels with some cheese. So again, you're providing a carbohydrate and a protein with this. Over here on the left, we talk about a 3-to-1 ratio. So 3 times the amount of carbohydrate, but the protein is definitely important. So here are some ideas, and your dietitians have access to some handouts that were developed out of Oregon, so they'll be able to give you information like this. So moving on to monitoring, we break this down into different categories of routine and conditional, and then I'll spend a little time talking about essential fatty acids. So Melanie talked quite a bit about acylcarnitines today, so we know how they're important in monitoring and different, especially with the diagnosing of the conditions and things to consider when you are following them. What came out of the guidelines is for routine monitoring. So probably each time you come in to see your provider, if you're coming in like every 3 to 4 months or maybe every 6 months, we're going to want to look at that creatine kinase again, which is the enzyme to know whether your muscles are happy or not. And then the carnitine levels, the total and free. And then other labs that would be helpful for your provider to assess your overall status are things like the acylcarnitine profile, your metabolic panel, which gives you glucose levels, liver functions. And then if you are one of those individuals following a really low-fat diet, we want to make sure that we're monitoring your essential fatty acids and possibly fat-soluble vitamins. If you have the form of VLCAD where you have some cardiac issues, then another part of your care is going to be seen by the cardiologist routinely. and then some labs that they will often monitor for your cardiac status are the troponin and then the BNP level. So as I mentioned, if you're one of the individuals following a pretty low-fat diet, and what that means is that generally all of us would maybe consume about 30% of our total calories from fat. So if you're one of those people that's been recommended to follow like 10% in your diet or 15% in your diet, this really should be adequate enough for you to have good essential fatty acid stores. But if for some reason you might be more strict with your diet, this is something that should be monitored. So we can see our omega-6 fatty acids are the linoleic and arachidonic, and the omega-3 fatty acids are the alpha-linolenic and the DHA. And you've probably heard of like essential amino acids, so similar to that. These fatty acids are fatty acids that we cannot make in our body, so they need to come from our diet. Some of you may know this already, but from the omega-6 fatty acid family, we usually find these sources of fatty acids in vegetable oils such as corn, safflower, and soybean. And with the omega-3 fatty acids, those are predominantly found in fish and flaxseed oil. So again, you can see if you're on a low-fat diet, you could be deficient in these, so it needs to be monitored. So what about if your levels are low and you need supplementations? For infants, the one nice thing is that if they need to be on a high MCT, low fat product, then we are reassured that medical food nowadays is supplemented with the essential fatty acids. These are some numbers that your dietitians will look at. So when you bring in your food records to your clinic visit, we're going to look to make sure that the amount of linoleic acid in your diet is falling between that 3 to 6% range of total energy, and the alpha-linolenic is about 0.5 to 1.2. So again, work with your dietitian if you feel like your diet needs to be adjusted. And then if your DHA levels are low, and this is information that comes from the LCHAD work out of Dr. Gillingham's lab, what's recommended for supplementation, you can see the numbers here. It's 60 milligrams per day for infants and toddlers, and then 100 milligrams per day for older individuals. So here's just a table that's available on the portal that Sandy talked about. These are oil sources of essential fatty acids, so I mentioned some of them. And so the flaxseed oil is the one that's highest in the alpha-linolenic, the omega-3, and then your safflower oil, which is high in the omega-6s. So if you weren't able to adjust your diet with food alone, your dietitian may be looking at one of these sources to help bring those levels up. So one of the last things that the guidelines talked about is what to do in pregnancy. So if you are a VLCAD female out there looking to get pregnant, there are some recommendations that came out of these guidelines. But just to first review the information that we had when we were looking at the literature. So there were a total of only 4 published papers which reported 12 pregnancies in 8 women, and 2 of these women had complications during pregnancy. So one of them had some issues with hyperemesis gravidarum in the first trimester, and then that really improved in her second and third trimester. And then the second person had some issues with rhabdomyolysis later on in the pregnancy. These women recovered and did pretty well, and the other part that can be problematic for women is what happens postpartum. So there was one woman described in the literature who developed heart failure who did recover 10 days after delivery. There was no long-term follow-up with the infants of these women, but all of these infants were normal at birth. So if you are planning a pregnancy, or if it's something that's in your future, things that we want you to keep in mind is to develop a plan with your metabolic and OB team, and that pregnancy planning and precautions and monitoring delivery should be included with that. What diet was working for you pre-pregnancy should work for you during pregnancy. So we want you to continue on the nutrition guidance that your team has given you. And then if you are experiencing any of like the nausea, the muscle cramped in, for you to be in touch with your metabolic team as soon as possible so that the team can help treat those symptoms. And then again, as I mentioned, with that one female having issues after delivery, monitoring you very closely for at least 8 weeks postpartum is really important. And if you are breastfeeding, there's no contraindication for that. We want to follow you closely as long as you are doing that, because you do need extra calories to prevent any issues. I want to see if, Sandy, have you come back in?
She has not, Mary.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going and then I'll work. Actually, I'm going to, if everybody will bear with me for a minute, I will go back to the area where she left off. So I don't want to miss, this was all really great information about what to do.
Oh, we just got her back. Sandy.
Oh, we did. Well, this is perfect. So I pulled Sandy. Are you okay to start here? I did my section and I was going to save a couple slides to the very end. I don't know if she would prefer to share her own slides.
She's muted. Let's just give her a second to get set.
Sure.
Can you guys hear me?
You're welcome back, Sandy.
Okay.
Sorry about
All
that.
right. I apologize. So back to the treatment principles. We do
Sandy,
want to.
Do you want to, Sandy, I'm sorry, do you want to do your own share or would you like me to do it?
I can do it.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go to your command. And Sandy, just so you know, I covered carnitine through pregnancy, and I was going to save the final slides until you were finished.
Okay. Back to the treatment principles. The first one was to avoid prolonged fasting. So in the guideline, we have established maximum fasting times based on age for those with severe VLCAD and those with moderate or mild VLCAD. You'll notice that the milder phenotypes can fast longer than those with severe VLCAD. So you need to consider the health status of the individual when establishing fasting recommendations. These times are for recommendations when the infant is healthy. If they are not healthy, then we need to reduce the fasting time. So what should I have as a bedtime snack? To meet the fasting guidelines and prevent catabolism, we're recommending a bedtime snack that emphasizes complex carbohydrates. Typically, if an individual is healthy and over the age of a year, taking a snack before bedtime allows that person to sleep all night without complications in the morning. So these are just some examples of bedtime snacks that are recommended, but you will need to work with your metabolic team to come up with a specific plan for you or your child. We also address illness and sick day precautions. One thing that we do emphasize in the guidelines that even those with mild VLCAD still are at risk for metabolic decompensation. This was a study from the group in Philadelphia. They're describing an infant who died at 38 hours with severe hypoglycemia, but didn't have cardiac involvement, and the genotype of this child was associated with mild disease. So even though those with mild VLCAD are at less risk for metabolic decompensation, it can happen, and everyone should receive an emergency protocol. So this is an example of an emergency letter that is found in the toolkit. Basically, we want to make sure that these letters include contact information for the metabolic physician on call, and also initial recommendations for the ER to initiate treatment for that individual. For at-home management, we're emphasizing that if somebody is ill, symptoms will develop because of the increase in fatty acid metabolites before hypoglycemia develops. So hypoglycemia is a later complication. So we do not want people to rely on glucose meters as a way to decide if they need medical help. Rather, we are emphasizing that they monitor clinical symptoms and not wait until hypoglycemia has developed to seek help. During illness, avoiding fasting is essential, and 4 hours is the maximum established for most ages during illness. And then during this time, to take as many calories as possible using simple carbohydrate. So this is one of the handouts that is found in the toolkit, giving sick day recipes for long chain fatty acid disorders. So these would apply to VLCAD as well as other disorders in this category. So we have a recipe for infants that includes Pedialyte and Polycal, which is glucose polymers. These are fast-acting source of glucose. And then we have several recipes for older individuals that are including juice or Gatorade and adding the glucose polymers. For diet composition, we're focusing on changing long chain and medium chain intake. One of the big questions that has developed over the years is, can a baby with VLCAD be breastfed? So when we initially started screening for VLCAD, everyone was treated with a very low long chain fat MCT diet, regardless of phenotype. As we've learned more over that time, we are now promoting breastfeeding in those who remain asymptomatic. So for those with a mild phenotype, it's okay to continue exclusive breastfeeding as long as the baby is growing okay and remaining clinically stable. For a moderate phenotype, breastfeeding is fine with addition of some medical formula. And those with a severe phenotype, we're recommending changing to a low-fat MCT supplemented formula, but some express breast milk may be able to be added to the formula without increasing the long chain fat too high. So this just kind of shows the difference in diet treatment between these two categories. So fat recommendations for infants are 40 to 50% of total calories. That does not change for either category, but what changes is the composition. So for mild phenotypes, we may not need any MCT at all, and the long chain fat can be the only source of total calories. For a more moderate phenotype, we'll probably want to go a 50-50 mix of long chain fat and MCT. This can be compared to a severe phenotype where we are restricting the long chain fat to 10 to 15% of total calories and requiring a much higher MCT intake. At this time, we're not really good at predicting the degree of treatment that's required for asymptomatic infants. So we are monitoring closely, looking at clinical symptoms and evaluating labs to decide if that infant can continue to exclusively breastfeed. We do have the lists of medical foods that are available for treatment of these disorders. The total fat for these different formulas ranges from about 30 to almost 50% of energy. Where things differ mostly is in the long chain content of these formulas. You'll see that this one has a lot more long chain fat than these others do. The progesterone is reserved for those with milder phenotypes, probably a more moderate phenotype, whereas these others can be used for those with a severe phenotype. We also give the MCT content of these formulas, which vary with the formula, but generally are around 20 to 40% of total calories. So how much long chain fat and medium chain fat should I consume? So this will be something that's determined by your clinic. It'll consider the child's age, the disease severity, clinical history. But the first step is to determine the amount of long chain fat that is recommended. For those with a milder phenotype, it'll be much lower than those with a severe phenotype. And then once that's determined, then we are meeting the total fat requirements for age by adding MCT. So this is one of the tables in the guideline. Here we are for different age groups. We're giving total fat recommendations. Again, these are not different than for the general population. Where things change is in the percent of calories from long chain fat. So for example, here, this for someone with a severe type of VLCAD, 1 to 3 years of age, long chain fat would be restricted to 10 to 15% compared to 20 to 35% for someone with a milder phenotype. And then the remainder of the fat calories are filled in with MCT. So again, those with a more severe phenotype will need more MCT than those with a milder phenotype. So considerations for MCT. One question that comes up is how long to continue formula. It's not necessary that formula stop at 1 year of age. I know our clinic typically continues until 2 years of age. Especially for those with more severe phenotypes, we might want to continue the formula longer. Transitioning to an MCT source, one way to do this is to come up with what we call MCT milk. And here the MCT can be added to low-fat or skim milk, And then additional protein or carbohydrate sources can also be added. The advantage of this kind of system is that it's a formula. We know how much we want that child to take over a 24-hour period. And sometimes this is less complicated than adding MCT to different foods. This is certainly an option though. This is a cookbook developed by OHSU. Melanie Gillingham Group put this together. That gives many recipes for using MCT in different foods with different recipes. This can be ordered through OHSU Bionutrition. We do give tables with the sources of MCT, so there are many out there, oil, powder, more liquid sources are available. The primary determinant of which one you end up using is really what's accepted by the individual. So in the toolkit, we have some MCT resources. So this is just one example of a handout from VitaFlow that gives easy mixing ideas for MCT. They also have a recipe guide as well. So the toolkit really emphasizes different resources. It's one-stop shopping so that especially dietitians can access different resources for this population. Another thing that we are emphasizing is increased protein intake. So studies that have been completed show that individuals that are consuming a more protein-based diet maintain lean body mass. This can provide a larger reserve against muscle loss, perhaps prevent muscle weakness, episodes of rhabdomyolysis. We do find a lower liver lipid content with higher protein diets. Maintaining metabolic control appears to be more superior than a carbohydrate-based diet. And even though we are decreasing the carbohydrate in these diets, it is not to the point that hypoglycemia is developing. So these were studies that included children over the age of 7, so this may not be appropriate for infants and toddlers. All right, I do believe we got to the point that Mary started.
So Sandy, if you could go to the your clinic visit slide.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's quite a few, but if you could just go to that one. So everyone, Sandy and I, could you back up one? Yep. So Sandy and I have a couple closing thoughts for all of you. So at your clinic visit, one of the things that we recommend is that you write down and bring your questions for your metabolic team, so your physician, dietitian, and other team members that you meet with. What's definitely a good idea is to bring your medications, the actual bottles, so that the physician could review the prescription. And the same thing for formulas, if it's not too inconvenient to carry what you're getting or take pictures of them, so that when you come to clinic, we can take a look at where you're actually getting to make sure everything is what we want you to get. Dietitians love 3-day food records. So before you come in, write down everything you're eating and drinking. And again, especially if you're on that low-fat diet, so we can take a look and make sure your fat is adequate in your diet. And then I know sometimes your families may be traveling quite a distance to get to clinic. You might be fasting for your labs when you come in. Please be prepared to have your formula if you need it, or snacks. Some additional resources for those of you who may not know, there's the Fatty Acid Disorder Family Support Group. and then the National Organization for Rare Diseases, which can often provide some financial support for you if that's needed with medications or copays for your visits. And then things that came out of the guidelines that we still don't know the answers to, that we're looking forward to including with future recommendations and updates are, as Sandy was just mentioning on that last slide, what is the role of the high protein diet for our patients? There is definitely some interest in using skim breast milk for our patients that need to be on those low fat diets. So how does that work and how effective can that be? We've talked quite a bit about lab measures. Melanie talked about the acylcarnitines, but looking more into what's going to help monitor the diet and your metabolic control. We need more information on pregnancy. We need to learn more about cardiomyopathy and rhabdomyolysis. Melanie talked a little bit about genotype and how that could possibly affect your acylcarnitines and how can we connect that with your treatment. Again, we talked a little bit about optimizing exercise tolerance, and then definitely what you've learned a little bit about is that TriHep is new to us, being FDA approved, how the clinics are going to be able to use that for those patients who could potentially benefit for that, and how that fills into the diet treatment. And I believe that's our last slide. So thank you very much for your attention. And thank you for Kira and Mito Action for inviting us today. And I think we have some time for questions.
Thanks, ladies. We just have one quick question. And that question is, several of us have started supplementing with walnut oil through our metabolic dietitians in order to get our linoleic acids where they should be. Is this the best option available right now?
So walnut oil is actually a great source for the linoleic. On the one slide that we had with the oil sources, it's not the highest in the linoleic, but what's also an advantage is there's also some of the alpha-linolenic in it. So it's actually a great choice for helping supplement those essential fatty acids.
Wonderful. Ladies, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. I apologize for the technical issues that we had. But you know, that's the world we live in right now, and we're all trying to adjust to all of this new technology that we're not accustomed to ruling our lives. So I appreciate everyone's patience. We're going to get started in the breakout sessions right after this. So just give us a few minutes to make the transition, but go ahead. You can click your links. I believe the moderators are already in the disease groups, and we will get ready to start with Ultragenics' leadership team to share a little bit about what's going on with Ultragenics. So again, I thank you both for your time, your patience, and sharing your expertise. And we look forward to staying in touch and sharing more about what the great work is that you guys are doing in the FAOD community. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now, everybody.
Bye.